Luke, so good to be here, and I hope to offer a inspiring performance like MJ or Willis Reed from my New York Knicks. The Mets are notorious for these freak injuries. Recently a dog bit one of the pitcher's hands. Another guy, he broke his leg because he was doing something on the farm. Random stuff. And so I'm at this game, first game in 3 years because of the pandemic. My wife got me some Father's Day Mets tickets, third row behind the dugout, having a great time. And then this towering pop up comes my way. And when it gets hit, I immediately go, well, I don't want to say exactly what I said, but I go, it's coming in my direction here. And me and another guy throw our hands up to try to catch this towering fly ball, pop up really. And then it just hit my pinky. And in the moment, I was like, wow, that feels more than a jam of my finger. And then by the next inning, my wife goes, I think you should get some ice or do you want to leave? And I said, no, I'm good. She goes, well, your hand is shaking. So this was the fifth inning. I said, no, I got a few more innings. I'm all right. And by the time we got home, my finger was very bruised and swollen. Went to urgent care, got an x-ray, fractured it, and actually just got back from a hand specialist. So thankfully, no tendon damage, but I'll be in this little thing here for a couple of weeks. I'm accident prone. When I was 14 and 15, I broke my wrist 2 years in a row, and I had a cast that went up to my shoulder. So I'm used to this. This feels a bit over the top here, but I'll milk it as much as I can, especially at home. I am preaching this Sunday, so I'll have to be the story. Oh, they're going to laugh first, and they're going to ask what everyone else, every single person who has heard my story asks a follow-up question. It's happened every time. I'm sorry. I'm surprised you haven't done it yet. And they said, "Did you catch the ball?" And the answer is no, because my finger was broken, and a little boy who was maybe 3 seats over from me just picks it up and shouts in the air like, "Yeah!" And I was like, you know what? I'm glad it's just this little boy and not some other guy who just picked it up because it was worth it there. So, but no, I didn't catch the ball, sadly. Well, here's the thing. This is my first and last time that I will ever do this. Now, I've been to games before, plenty of games, and I've never gotten it this close to like it literally came to my seat, like the pop up, and the guy reached over and but I've never had it this close. But from now on, I will go to the game with my baseball glove in hand, ready. You know what? No shame in my game. Let me put my pride to the side. I am wearing my glove whenever I go to a game from now on. Yes. Okay. It's yeah, yeah. Someone just actually a friend of mine left a message saying, "Rich, I hope your finger's doing well, and this may be God's sign to you to become a Yankees fan." He literally just said that maybe 2 hours ago, and that's just absolutely a word from the pit of hell. So I refuse to receive any of that. I don't think I can stomach that. Correct. Very nice. Mhm. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Me too. Yeah, it's a poem. I'm a big fan of Hughes and have read a number of his poems over the years. And I read that one maybe I want to say for the first time maybe 6 years ago. And I never forgot it. It was one of those poems that whenever there was something going on in the world that was just crazy, every other day, Luke, I just thought this would be a great time just to post this poem, just because I think it speaks to longing. I think it speaks to the deep desire of the soul, and also speaks to the not just the problems of the day, but the invitation to look deeper beneath the surface. And so all of those things really served as, in many ways, the impetus, not just behind the title of the book, but the larger goal that I had in mind to identify the worms beneath the surface, if you will, that are keeping us from the kind of good and beautiful and kind life that God has for us. Mm-hmm. I think there has been an intensification of the polarization, the challenge, the divisiveness over the past couple of years. And again, part of it is the convergence of those three realities of a global pandemic, of the level of political hostility, or if you want to go as far as say political idolatry, as well as the racial injustice. And so the convergence of those three things, and plus you add to it just the ongoing burgeoning presence of social media, the ubiquitous nature of our thoughts and our words. Never in human history have we had access to this level of thinking across the board with everyone. And so, because everyone has a voice, which is a great gift, but also a great limit and challenge, I think we're seeing the exacerbation of all those things, especially in the last couple of years. Queens, New York City. Spider Man. Yep. Captain America's from Brooklyn. Spider Man's from Queens. Hmm. Yeah, in some ways, it's very challenging because what we have in Queens across the country, you could say there is in churches the reality that we have in Queens. I think we have it on a scale, however, that's a little deeper and higher than others, only because of our diversity. 75 nations represented in our congregation, in a neighborhood where 123 languages are spoken, a church that has lots of generational diversity. ideological, political, theological diversity, people coming from all kinds of traditions, whether it's Pentecostal, Catholic, Reformed, Episcopal. We have folks coming from all kinds of backgrounds and experiences at New Life. And so the last couple of years have revealed in many ways the ways that our values, apart from saying, yeah, we love Jesus, but after that, the values that mean a lot to us have come to the surface in some profound ways. And I think part of that is because of the nature of our diversity. You get that many different people within a community together, you're bound to find all kinds of different ways of seeing the world and understanding the world and values of the world. So the last few years have been very difficult for us as a church. Yet, I mean, God, I think, has sustained our community in some beautiful ways. Yet there's been some really significant challenges. You know, it's funny because what I would say is what's come more to the surface are the fears more so than the values. I think our congregation would say that, you know, we have five particular values. I mean, I wrote about this in the Deeply Formed Life, you know, template of rhythms and racial justice and interior examination and sexual wholeness and missional presence. What I think what comes to the surface is not so much a value whenever there's tension, but fears. And so whenever after the murder of George Floyd, and lots of the fears were, oh, wow, our church is participating in a prayer protest in Queens. And the fears that emerged was, wow, is New Life becoming a political movement? Is New Life now, has New Life aligned itself with Black Lives Matter? That's really the great fears. Has New Life now become more liberal or what have you? So I think those were the larger fears. And in Queens, it's a bit different than Manhattan. New York City is generally a very liberal, progressive city and state. Queens, however, because of the nature, I think, of immigrants, and because it's a lot different than Manhattan, we find a lot more conservative and moderates within our community. And so some of those folks are wondering, wow, what's happening to our church? So I think that's what really came to the surface, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about politics, which is why I did a 6-week series. Luke, do you remember 2020? It was kind of crazy. I did a 6-week a 6-week series on the church, politics, and the gospel right before the election, and I think we were able to navigate much of the tensions in that series because we were trying to identify what's happening beneath the surface, as Langston Hughes was talking about in that poem. But even so, lots of difficult conversations, lots of tensions along the way. Yeah, it's not the popular way to start a book. All right, we're going to dive into it. First, we're going to talk about sin. And that's for Christian and non-Christian alike. And I think part of that is because we have often understood sin within categories of shame and with categories of condemnation. And so to talk about sin is often done from a position of religious, hierarchical kind of way of living in the world. You're not good enough. You're not measuring up enough, and here's your sin. The approach I take is a bit different in that I'm trying to locate sin not from the perspective of moral transgression so much as it is failure to love. And so what I do is I make this theological connection saying that if the greatest command is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, if that's the greatest command, then the greatest sin must be failure to live out that command, which in short is failure to love. And so for me, sin is this idea of failing to love as God would have us to love. That makes it a bit different than how we typically think about it in terms of our moral inconsistency with the most blatant kind of sins that we keep secret to ourselves. So I began there because at the core of it, sin is failure to love, but it is part of a larger principle that organizes human life. Something's profoundly broken with the world that keeps us, what St. Augustine says, incurvatus in se, just turned in on ourselves to the point that it obscures and blocks out love. So I went big, man. So I started off big, saying if we're going to address the problems of brokenness in the world, it's not going to happen by us trying a little bit harder. It's going to come into focus by us getting a better picture, a clearer picture of what it means that we are marked by sin. So, yeah, hopefully that. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and what I'm trying to do, that's really well said, Luke, and what I'm trying to do in starting it off by talking about sin is to make the connection between wholeness and sin. I'm essentially saying to move, to be rescued from sin is to now be turned upward and outward. Uh, and so, as opposed to be turning inward in the most negative way. I mean, I talk a lot about turning inward in a very positive way. I'm talking about turning inward in a very self-referential. The world revolves around me and my desires and my passions or whatever, my perspective. I want to now turn outward, and wholeness emerges not through greater simply self-actualization or self-awareness. Wholeness emerges as we love well, and so the good and beautiful and kind. If I can even summarize that even more, what I mean by becoming whole is loving well. And to the degree that our lives love well is the degree to which we will experience the kind of wholeness that we long for, that moves us away from the fractures and the sin that so marks our lives. Mhm. Yeah, so much of our spirituality, in terms of Christian spirituality, again, becomes so privatized and self-referential. And then we find ourselves, I think it was in that chapter that I allude to a quote from Thomas Merton that says that the devil makes many disciples by preaching against sin. Uh, and whenever we find ourselves so fixated with our failures in such a way, or our goodness in such a way that again keeps us focused on ourselves, we've missed out on the whole thing. And our lives are no longer oriented towards God or towards our neighbor, but again, oriented towards a life driven by performance, moralism, which really becomes one of the great obstacles to truly understanding and living into the gospel of grace. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And hopefully, with that understanding, it'll help us as a follower of Jesus. My hope is that it'll move us towards Jesus. That to deal with sin is not simply about education or kind of, again, moral improvements. The depth of sin is so deep and powerful that we need a power outside of ourselves to rescue us from its grip. And hopefully, this understanding of sin will point us to our need for the gospel of grace, which is why Barbara Brown Taylor, at the end of that chapter I mentioned, where she talks about sin as our only hope, which is very counterintuitive because we don't think about sin as our only hope. We think about Jesus as our only hope. But sin, if rightly understood, can become our hope if it ultimately points us and pushes us to our need for God. Yeah, that's correct. Yep. No, I'm expecting, I preached my sermon, it was my first sermon at New Life, and I'm thinking, wow, hey, Rich, great job. Thank you. We have another service. Can't wait to hear it again. That's what I was hoping. And well, it's interesting because he began with so much, and Peter's always done that with me. Hey, this was great. Wow, that was great. But I think you can strengthen it a little bit by doing, this and that. And I'm thinking to myself, who the hell do you think? I mean, that's what I'm thinking. Who do you think you are talking to me like that, man? And now he was my boss, but what I was getting at and what I get out of the chapter is how fragile my soul was in that moment and how defensive my soul was, and still has a tendency of being whenever something is exposed in me. So, uh, yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, by soul fragility, I'm really talking about uh, this hyper defensiveness that emerges in us whenever something is exposed. Now, whenever we hear in some contexts, Luke, there's a book that came out called White Fragility, in which someone was writing about race and the level of fragility that white people have when they talk about race and all that. But what I'm getting at is there's even something deeper that all of us have, and it is a soul fragility that at some point in our lives there are um, there's a defensiveness that emerges whenever something from our false self is confronted, something is exposed, and again, it leads us to this hyper defensiveness because we're trying to protect something, which is why the virtue of humility, what I write about humility, what I get at is humility is essentially poverty of spirit, and poverty of spirit is a recognition that there's nothing to prove, nothing to protect, and nothing to possess. And if my life is lived with nothing to prove, nothing to protect, not even the bad parts of my life, and nothing to possess, there's nothing to cling to. That is interior freedom that can move me beyond the kind of soul fragility. But we're all to some degree fragile, and the people who are most angry and most protective, those are the folks actually who are manifesting the greatest amount of soul fragility. Even though on the outside, it might seem like an exterior shell, on the inside, what's really happening is there's fragility there. Yeah, yeah, very. Well, I think part of to lower our defenses and live from that place requires, um, in many ways, compassionate self confrontation with ourselves. I think the reason why we are so fragile, the reason why I'm so fragile is because there's so many messages and lies that are so deeply entrenched in my mind and in my heart that if to the degree that I can expose those lies and messages is the degree to which I can live in greater freedom. And so I think whenever there's something like whenever a part of my life is being challenged, being questioned, whenever someone's going, hey, I'm just curious as to why you said this, I could see that as a threat to my very existence, or I could see that as an opportunity for me to once again try to get at the messages that have still formed my deepest sense of identity. My deepest sense of identity is I'm loved by Jesus. That's my deepest sense of who I am. And anything that seeks to usurp that and replace that is a false identity, is a false self. And so having a sense of compassionate self confrontation is, I think, really important when we're talking about humility, which is why, most folks, and I believe I said it something along the lines of when people think about humility, they think about doing lowly tasks as opposed to lowering our defenses. And I do think humility is about doing lowly tasks as well. I mean, I don't want to get away from that. That's one facet of humility. But humility is also, which is why I love the Desert Father tradition, because we see it within the Desert Fathers and mothers, this sense of there's nothing to protect. If you've noticed something wrong in me, as the desert tradition would say, you should see what else is inside of me. If you would see what else is inside of me, you go, what? That's in you as well. There's a freedom, nothing to prove, nothing to protect, nothing to possess. And so when I think about humility and soul fragility, I think honestly naming those messages are so important. Yeah, yeah, Uh, let's, if memory serves me correctly, I think Roar is probably the one that's most poignant in this. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, which is why there's a line that we often use at New Life at our church that says, what does my reaction tell me about me? I know what my reaction tells me about somebody else. Yeah, what does my reaction tell me about me? We often say that in when we train small group leaders or train people in community to say, if you are in close proximity to someone else, at some point they're going to say something that's going to trigger a response. And I know what my reaction tells me about you. You're a jerk or whatever it is. But before we go there, what does my reaction tell me about me? And I think that's a better place where God wants to operate because there's always something else that God longs to heal and make whole. But that roar quote essentially gets at in very succinctly what I'm trying to get at here. Yeah, I think part of what I have to recognize is the roller coaster of response is normal. And I don't know if I will ever get to a point where I will totally not have any kind of uh, difficult feelings when I read something that is challenging something I said or what I represent or what have you. My first impulse is shame. That something's wrong with me, that I'm bad. I'm not the pastor that I thought I was. I'm not the preacher that I thought I was. I thought I was better than that. And I think that's where my mind typically goes. And then right after that is usually anger. And I'm thinking, who the heck did this person think they are? And I want to see them preach a sermon, and I want to see you exposit a text the way I exposit it. And now I go down a whole road of imaginary conversations and how much I'm a better preacher than they are and thinker than I mean, it's all again the false self, as opposed to. No, so I go through this. Now here's the challenge. This is what I've learned about my life. When that happens, I'm usually going into a hole. That's language for me. I'm in a bad place right now. I go into the hole. It's not that I don't go into the hole anymore, but I don't go as deep and as long as I used to. I used to be in the hole for a long time, number of days, and I used to get deep in there. So it's not that I don't go in the hole, but I'm not hanging there as long as I used to. And I think part of it is along the way, I've had some, I think, encounters with God and encounter through people, through friends, through spiritual directors, through counselors, through my wife, through just relationships that have helped me to get a little bit more objective about what I'm experiencing in the moment. And so a large part of it is, this is what this person is feeling at the moment. How can back to sin and incurvatus and say my response when I turn inward in that way again I'm being marked by sin. I'm turning in on myself as opposed to might there be some hidden nuggets of wisdom that I need from this person Is there a blind spot that they are revealing to me? Or is there something that this is just their anxiety, and the best gift that I can give them is my presence, my loving, tender presence? That's where I've tried to go. And I'll tell you what, I think I've gotten a lot better in doing that, but I still think that those first initial responses are still there. And I don't know if I'll ever, I pray that the day comes where I get an email that's critical, or sometimes it's not even critical. Sometimes it's, hey, can we talk about whatever? And I'm thinking, oh no, what's wrong with me? That's where I typically go. I don't know if I'll ever be done with that. I hope I will. But I'm not there as long as I am. So part of it is the messages, the scripts, those things that are so deep in my subconscious that, again, just needs to come to the surface. And I think the more that I'm able to give myself to that level of reflection, of identifying those false messages, those false scripts, I think I now experience a little bit more freedom to be present with others, uh, and to truly enter into their world. Mhm. Mm. Yeah, I think part of it goes to the true self. I would say is oriented around at least two things. Number one, it's communion with God, and number two, it's character formation. And so I know I'm living from the true self when I get criticized and I go, Lord, is there something in me that still needs to be formed by you? And is this person offering me a gift for my ongoing formation in you? Now, I'm not saying that's easy, and I'm not saying that's where I usually go. But I know when that's happened in my life, and again, it usually happens after I experience that shame and that anger and that, hey, I want to see you do it better than me. So once I get through all of the false self of that there, and hopefully I'm not in there too long, then I can step back and say, Lord, is there, the true self longs for ongoing communion with God. The true self, your life, Colossians 3 says, your life is hid with Christ in God. That's where my life is. There's the level of intimacy that the true self has with God, and I want to live in that place. But I also want character formation. And so if my heart is aligned in those ways, I want ongoing communion with God, and I want my character to be shaped by Jesus. Then when criticism comes, it becomes an opportunity, which is why, back to Rohr, Rohr says in one of his books that, and I have not achieved this level of enlightenment, Luke, but he says that he prays for to have not offended. It's kind of like for one humiliation a day, something along those lines, because so the false self can be put in its place. And I'm thinking, I'm not to the point where I'm praying for the false self to be offended in a given day, but by God's grace, hopefully one day in the distant future, I suppose, I'll be able to pray something along those lines. Yeah. Yeah, those three stages are not unique to me. I'm trying to use just different language to get at kind of the age-old cycle of human relationships. In that that first stage is usually one marked by idealism and romanticism. Whether we're talking about a new relationship that's romantic, whether we're talking about a new job, a new church, it usually begins very nice. I could tell who the new people are in our congregation almost immediately because they speak so glowingly about our church. What a church! I've never been to a place like this before. The people are so nice. The sermons are so great. Why? And I go, well, how long have you been here? 2 weeks. Well, all right, stick around for a little bit. And then inevitably, what happens is because we create these, we're marked by idealization and idealism. Whenever our dreams, whenever our idols are now put into question, it's amazing how the pendulum swings the other way, and it becomes more of a hellish environment. And by hellish, I just simply mean if the first stage is heaven, the second stage is hell. I'm just saying it's usually that place where people are no longer seen as total angels, but we can swing the pendulum to seeing people as demons. And so we find out, oh, that person voted for who? Why am I at this church? This church is that kind of church. And the holding the tension stage is just a recognition, I think, theologically as well as psychologically and socially, that we are not angels, neither are we demons. I think we're somewhere in between. And church is not heaven, and neither is it hell. It's somewhere in between. And I think if we can hold that mixture within our own selves, number one, that we are full of mixture, I think it can give us the capacity to more effectively be in close proximity and navigate the conflicts that we experience. I'm not talking about, Luke, the abuse. I'm not talking about the toxicity. I'm talking about the regular conflicts that we experience 1 week to the next. And usually it's those conflicts. It's often not the really big stuff that gets people to leave a job or leave a church or end the relationship. It's often some of the simple conflicts that harken back to the soul fragility. I cannot stay in this space any longer, and so I'm out of here, as opposed to I'm going to do my best by God's grace to try to work through this conflict as opposed to running away from it. As am I. Yeah. That's so well said. And our world is marked by that dualism, that binary you're talking about of good and evil, righteous and unrighteous. And that's not to say that there's no space for very clear calls for justice and clear calls to point out evil and clear calls to root out abuse and such. But we're not talking about here. We're talking about some of the just regular conflicts, differences that we see that so easily move us to seeing people in very one-dimensional ways. And I think that's what hopefully this book is helping us to do, to see beyond just that very dangerous dualistic way of thinking. Yeah, correct. Yeah, to that point though, Luke, I mean, I have heard enough pushback from people to your point of what about and what about and what about. And so whenever I could insert and just be crystal clear in the moment to say, I'm not talking about this, I'm talking about that here, it's just really important because I could just hear people say, but what about? Of course. You know what? I remember that question now. If I'm gonna give you the first. Now I'm a hip hop like lover, and I have lyrics that I prayed to God that God would erase from my brain because they're just so unchrist. But here's the first song that came to my mind, and it's a song called "Annie Up" by MOP. And I don't think people should YouTube it right now because it's pretty vicious. But if I'm going into the octagon and I want to go in there uh, swag, even though I'm going to get knocked out in 20 seconds, or at least want to go out with a song like that. And so um, I would say MOP, Annie Up, and yeah, if I just and a warning to your listeners, if they just go on YouTube right now, not used to hip hop and all that there, they might go, is this guy even a Christian? But again, I have these songs lodged in my each memory bank here. So it's deep in my soul, man. And whenever it comes up on the radio, wherever I'm at there, I'm transported back to my days in Brooklyn. Now, it was crazy because it came out in 2020 of September, and so the world was shut down, and so there was no launch party. No, we did a thing on social media in my living room. My wife helped me out. It was wonderful and awkward, and this time around, we're hoping to have a proper kind of book release party, whether in our home or somewhere else. So. But the first time around, there was nothing along those lines. You know, yeah, very fortunate. I'm very grateful that the book has done very well and continues to do really well. But here's what kept it in perspective for me. There were people who were not able to have graduation ceremonies the way that they wanted to and weddings. So I thought, this is a book release here compared to like graduations and funerals and weddings. I didn't want to go down the road of it could be worse, but that's where my mind was thinking, you know what, whatever, it's all good. Mm, yeah. Thanks again, Luke.